Well, Stephanie, welcome. Welcome, and I guess goodbye. I mean,
Yeah.
we've had an interesting week here in Boston on the campus of MIT, and sitting in this beautiful converted firehouse
It's
hotel,
amazing.
which is kind of interesting, here in Cambridge. But I think, um, you know, there's a little cachet being here and being, on the campus of MIT. There's sort of this expectation of great things, just this sort of just being here, right? So it's been such a good week and good to have you. And thank you for being on the podcast. But my first question for you, it's the first question I ask everyone. So anyone that's watching is always hearing this question and waits for the answer. Who is Stephanie Worley?
So, who is Stephanie? I would start with I'm a mom, a wife, a leader of a talent acquisition team, uh, an advocate for women in business, and a daughter. I think that's a big part of who I am. A daughter to two folks that were teachers. And I'm a gardener and a baker.
So why on your LinkedIn profile, why do you begin with mom? That's a really rare thing. People, for obvious reasons, think of LinkedIn as a professional
Mhm.
network, and that's a very personal thing. You started off talking about, who you are, your mom first. Why is that important for people to know about you, that is the priority?
Because I think so often women in business feel like you have to downplay, especially when you are in a leadership role, right? You downplay your family obligations. And for me, it's the most important job I've done on earth, right? I think I changed that on my LinkedIn profile um, after my mom passed away because she was such a huge influence to me. And I just took some time because of that whole experience with her, and she died of breast cancer. And how it happened and how quickly it happened, it just made me take a step back because I did make some sacrifices in that situation for work versus being at home as much as I should have probably been when she was going through that. And so I just kind of took a step back and had to rebalance myself and say, what is the most important thing to me? And my kids are the most important thing. My family, not just my kids, my husband, my family, everybody is.
So what did your mom teach you about being a woman of strength and being vocal about that? What lessons did you learn from her?
So my mom was an English teacher, and she and my dad were married until I was in seventh grade, and I saw her go through this struggle of she was a teacher, and we had moved out away from Ohio into Illinois. And when my parents got divorced, she had a really difficult time once we moved back to Ohio getting back into teaching because there was not a shortage of teachers at the time. Tenure was difficult. It was hard to break in if you already had all that tenure. And so she changed careers midlife, right? And I saw her try and do a lot of different things. And so for me, it was about her always just setting the expectation that nothing is outside of your reach, right? You shouldn't be inhibited by who you are, where you come from. You just have to do your best and take the opportunity to take a risk sometimes and not be afraid to take a risk and not be afraid to fail. So I never felt like, I guess the lesson I learned from my mom was don't be afraid to fail and don't be afraid to take the risk.
Is that difficult? And I dare say that it's easy to say. That's not even an easy thing to say, because I think it comes with a heavy responsibility to explain that especially when you're younger. And I do think, we are recognizing that, we have done a disservice, to women in business over these years. I think we've a long way to go. But I do think there is that recognition. So even saying that to a woman, and I've said it to my own sister.
Mhm.
I've said it to people that I've worked with, females that have been on my team, that you have to take the risk. But it's very different when you're a woman being told that, and when you're a man being told that. Because for a man, it's like, of course, I want to take risks because
Right.
Again, tell me a little bit about that, because that's an even harder thing to say. It's an even harder thing to do. How do you look at these generations coming up, especially women that are coming up into business, maybe want to be leaders, maybe don't, individual contributors, which is fine. You can be
For
whomever you're meant to
sure.
be. You don't have to be a leader. Although I think there's more pressure, on females to want to be leaders. I don't know why, for whatever reason. And maybe we can explore that a little bit. But how do you help that next generation understand what does it actually mean, to be a bit fearless and take those risks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that part of the reason why I'm more comfortable taking risks is because I have such a strong support system. And I think that's developed more from a business perspective and even in my personal life as I've moved through my career. And I would say when I started my career, I worked in an organization that was primarily led by women. And we weren't always supportive of each other. Sometimes we were our own worst enemies. And so what I have found is that you have to surround yourself with people who empower you and who are there to support you. I have two very good friends who are just advocates for women and for doing what you need to do and to be fearless and not apologize for taking the risk and taking the chance. But I think what I would say to younger generations coming up in business is make sure you're knowledgeable about what you're talking about, evaluate the risk that you're going to take. Is it worth it? And then make sure that you have a plan if all else fails, right? And I think I said this when we were talking about, when I was talking to somebody else about just don't be afraid to say no. Like you have to learn from your mistakes and don't be afraid to learn from your mistakes because just don't make them again, right? Make the mistake, learn from it, iterate on it, and keep moving forward. And don't beat yourself up about it.
Success is a terrible teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I can't think of anything worse for me as an individual learning to grow into whatever my role was at the time, new skill and everything. But you get a little bit of success, and there is a little bit of arrogance. I think that we all have a little bit of ego. Okay, I've got this, and
Yeah.
I've learned in my time to literally never say those words to myself. I've got this, but I used to say it all the time. But what I'm really interested in understanding, you talked a little bit about advocacy, being an advocate. I don't think there's enough understanding of what it means to be an advocate for, and let's be very precise, for women in your organization. If you're a male in your organization, in your view, what does it mean to have a strong male presence, being an advocate for a strong female presence in an organization? What's the expectation? Because that's really where a lot of the problem lies, even though you might have had an experience with other women, and that's just, dynamics of working together.
For sure.
Right? But the reality is that most business is still heavily controlled, male versus female. And we need to have more advocacy from the male side to promote and to make sure that there is equal opportunity and equal support. I think a lot of men don't understand what it means to be an advocate. Maybe they're afraid to be an advocate. Maybe they don't know the ground rules. What is it though that we're missing in order to be a strong advocate?
Well, I would say in my current company, we're actually it's very female heavy. It's just the nature of the organization. But we have a lot of men in our organization today that work there. And I've worked in heavily male organizations as well, right? And so for me, being an advocate is listening to what I have to say. It is putting value behind what I say. And I don't want to, it seems really cliche to say, just treat me like a business partner, right? Like, but it's almost that, right? And I think that recognizing when you observe others not necessarily putting value on what a female is saying at the table, and making sure that you have a seat at the table, or that they have a seat at the table. But I think it's the same question that you ask from a DEI perspective. How do you be an advocate when you're not part of that affinity group, right? And so I think from a male perspective, I would say that the best thing that my male colleagues could do would be to listen, respect, and value my opinion. And don't be afraid to ask the question, like, why are you saying that, Stephanie? Right? Like, I don't understand that. And I don't know if that really answers your question. Maybe I'm not.
Well, I mean, I think it does a little bit. It's, what I'm trying to get the heart is, I think there is a strong desire, for supporting, but sometimes finding the path to that can be really difficult, right? You don't, am I saying the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? You catch yourself. That's not a bad thing, by the way.
Right.
Making us think about what we say and how we act is how we grow. And
Right.
it is that, and it's not necessarily a risk or being fearless, but it's also, how do you do it in a way that's productive, right? In a way that is being perceived, within the community as being supportive. And that's not something that I think people talk about enough.
Yeah.
Or are taught. How do we tackle this problem? And it is a very big problem. It still is a very big problem.
Yeah.
Right? But how do we tackle it if we're not having the conversation about, how do you want me to approach this? And the person who's asking is genuinely trying to learn and change the ways. And I'm 54 years old, right? And I've been around the block for a long time. I absolutely come from a time when, if you were not in my affinity group, you were absolutely thought to be less than.
Yeah.
And I was taught that. I was taught that for a lot of reasons, right? I come from a military family, very traditional, brought up, I'm 54, but my parents were born in the 50s. So you're talking about the nuclear family. Mom stays
Right.
at home, doesn't have a career. My mom kind of had a career, but not really. She was a homemaker, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, for anyone that chooses to do that, or their situation dictates that. But the reality is, sometimes breaking those molds, there's a desire to do it, but there isn't an easy path. Maybe it is easy. It isn't easy. But the challenge is understanding how to have that conversation without being perceived to be anything other than somebody who wants to be part of the solution. And I think that's a really big problem that we've got, particularly in modern societies. We don't know really how to have that conversation. Right? How can I be the best advocate I can be? Because it may sound good to say, just treat me like others. But when the others in the room aren't recognizing the effort,
Right.
and you're kind of, beaten into a wall, like, you're not doing enough. Well, okay, I don't really know what to do then. Like, I didn't learn this. I don't know this. I think new generations coming in are a little bit more open, which is very refreshing to see. But it's a real challenge.
Yeah. I think we just have to show up differently, right? Like, all of us have to show up differently. On the flip side, I also think women have to be able to have those conversations, and difficult conversations are hard to have for most people, right? And so, one of the things that I do is I mentor, right? So I take the time out, I mentor, and I think that, early career folks, I think it's important for men to not just mentor other men, right? You pull women into those programs, and you invite them to have a seat at the table. But I think it's also okay to recognize that maybe I shouldn't have said that way. How could I have said that differently? How would you have felt differently if I hadn't said it like that?
Have the opportunity to make the mistake in the
Yeah.
conversation.
We're so afraid.
And self-correct and be recognized for the correction. I think that, there are some things that are clearly not right. But I also think in society in general right now, that when someone does course correct, we punish them for it.
Correct. Yeah.
And in a business setting, that can be very brutal. And I think people see that. And this doesn't really even matter what gender you are, what your ethnicity is, what your religious preference or background is. We punish people for admitting their mistakes right now. And I think social media is the worst outlet of that. How do we combat that? Because if we expect the world to change and we want this equality of opportunity, and people recognize when they're wrong, and we just beat the hell out of them for it, especially in a social media setting, how do we combat it?
Yeah, it's almost like it's almost we're unable to be kind to each other anymore, right? Like that's how it feels sometimes to me. That it is always this butting of heads and this consternation around you made that mistake, so now you're my enemy, right? Like that's not how the world should work, right? We should be able to say, I made a mistake. I recognize that I made a mistake. I get it. I have work to do. I understand that. And people should be able to accept that, right? And that is not how we are today. And I do believe that social media, I worry about it, right? I have 3 kids, and I've seen how social media has progressed, right? My oldest is 28. And I think back to when she got her first phone, when did she start getting on social media, and the impact that has had on each of them, right? She's much more active. My other 2 are not as active on social media. But they see it too, right? They see exactly what you're talking about. Like, why is it so negative?
It's very, very polarizing. And politics doesn't help.
Yeah.
No matter what your politics are,
For sure.
The entire world, obviously we just,
Yeah.
got through a presidential election, here in the States, and the entire world is watching that, and couldn't have been more polarizing. On both sides. I do believe that inherently people are good, and I think one of the pieces of advice I'm taking from you is understanding that that there is, and take the approach of positive intention. And when we do that, it sort of lowers the temperature a little bit in the room, for yourself, and you're able to be a little bit more receptive to the listening and to actually hearing what someone's saying versus just hearing the words. And I think that's important. I want to go back to being a mom, because I think I want to understand how, from a business perspective, you're a very accomplished executive, and you're running a fairly large organization. How does that translate when your kids, I have a 5 and 8-year-old, I had a 26-year-old, but I know that, what it's like when we call them kids. But how do you put the perspective of being an executive, a leader, in the perspective of also being a mom with them? Because I think that there's a dichotomy that can happen. When do you shut off Stephanie Worley, the executive, and turn on Stephanie Worley, the mom? Does that ever happen? Or is it okay to blend those worlds at home?
Yeah. I've actually, so interestingly enough, I've worked from home since my youngest was 2. So I've worked from home. So they have seen me in my work world since they were young, right? My oldest was 8 at the time. My youngest was 2. Middle one was 4. And so I think that I have more balance there than I've ever had before. I would say that I didn't always set a great example for my kids because I was working crazy amounts of hours, especially when I was in the BPO industry. I was getting on at 6 a.m. and logging off at 11, right? And I was lucky enough to have a fantastic husband who supported me, and a mom and in-laws that helped care for my kids and did all those things. But I always prioritized, I traveled a lot, but I always prioritized my kids' events, their things that they were doing. I was still a really involved mom, and it was exhausting, but it was so worth it to me, right? I had to do that. But I think that what my kids have learned from me is, so while I say it was bad that they saw me work all those hours, I also think they saw a work ethic around how you have to show up and bring yourself to work, and what you have to do to advance in your career. And I don't mean you have to work 14 hours a day. I mean, you have to be there. they've heard me probably walking past my office, coaching and developing people. They've heard me giving really tough feedback. They've heard me, having conversations and negotiating for salaries with folks. So they've heard all of those things. And so I actually think it's given them an interesting perspective of the business world. I laugh because when I took my oldest to her first college career fair, we walked past the business school table and she said, "Business, is that what you do? I don't want to do that." Now she's in business. She's a marketing manager and a social media manager for a company. But turning it. I think I bring my mom. I think I bring my mom into my work because I really care about the people.
Just from a leadership perspective, when you talk about being a mom, and you're, blending those worlds constantly, let's reverse it a little bit and talk about the folks on your team. Did they see, even if they don't know it, the Stephanie Worley, the mom, coming out, the nurturing side, the coaching side, humanizing a lot of the work that they do? Why is that important for a leader to maybe not separate those things?
Well, because I think that the way you build, I think you get the most out of your team when they're engaged, when they believe in where you're going. And I think in order to do that, you have to be a leader that brings your whole self to work, right? Or your best self to work. And part of the best self, part of the best part of me is how I am a mom. Now, I would say sometimes I'm more patient at work than I am at home. But I will also say that I am a huge believer in everybody brings something different to the table. And so all three of my kids are very, very different, raised in the same household, but very, very different human beings, all fantastic human beings. But when I've built teams and I've built leadership teams, it's about building teams that are different and are complementary and that kind of work together and almost build this like work family. I don't want to call it a work family, but your family is rounded out because everybody in your family brings something different. Your teams at work are rounded out because everybody brings something different. And so I think if you can recognize that and understand that that's how I don't want my kids to be just like me. I want them to take the best parts of me and then be themselves. I want my teams not to be just like me. I want them to make me better, right? My kids make me better as a mom. I want my teams to make me better as a leader. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that you are bringing the right type of talent to your team and not all cookie cutter.
No, so that comes down to, what do you value? So as a leader, what do you value in the leaders that have inspired you?
I value so I worked for a woman years ago. I was a VP of TA at a BPO organization, and she had no TA background whatsoever. She was a process person. She was probably the best leader I've ever worked for. She was amazing. And what I learned from her was the value of data and how important it can be in driving decisions, but also influencing businesses. And what she also taught me was the importance of really listening and understanding. And so what I value in leaders are people who listen, who are honest, who are transparent, but also are accountable. And they're willing to say when they've made a mistake. And that are willing to listen to the folks in the room, because that's why you hired me. You didn't hire me to do what you said. You hired me to lead an organization and a function. And if you want me to do that, you've got to let me be empowered. And so I think it's also those that empower the people that work for them. And I think that's how I lead. I don't want to tell my people what to do every single day. I hired you for a reason. You're a leader. Go do your job. You know what to do. I'll be there to help you.
I think that's a great way to leave this. Know your job and do your job. Be trusted to do it, I think is probably the most important thing. And when you work for someone that that you feel that trust, that you've given them some sense of agency and maybe a little bit of runway to do things, I think great things happen.
For sure.
So, Stephanie, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.